Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello everyone, my name is Marika, and I just wanted to say a very warm welcome from the alumni team here at King's. We're so grateful to have so many of you joining us today on Zoom. A big welcome also to those of you viewing this on our King's YouTube channel. Apologies. As some of you may know, this is one of a series of webinars we put together especially for members of the King's alumni community, showcasing some of our academic and alumni expertise on some of the most pertinent topics of our current time. If you have a look at the alumni website, you'll find a full listing of all the events and programming we have planned for the near future. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers lined up for you today, who are going to be sharing their unique perspectives on how the pandemic might impact the culture sector, looking at both the challenges the sector is facing, but also some of the potential opportunities we might have in this area, and of course, what the new normal might look like for such an integral part of our society. Our chair today is Baroness Deborah Bull. Deborah is Vice President and Vice Principal for London at King's and also serves as Senior Advisory Fellow for Culture, providing leadership for the university's cultural strategy. Hopefully you've already had the chance to read the impressive bios of our panel members today. We've got Dr. Kate Macmillan, Teaching Fellow in the Department for Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's, Natalia Petrova, King's alumna who is currently working as an international consultant in the arts and culture sector, and Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford, who we're honoured to have as a King's Cultural Fellow and is also inaugural director of V&A East. Before I hand over to our chair, just a little about how the format of the webinar will work. So we'll first hear from our panelists and some background and context of today's topic. And this will then be followed by some Q&A. So if you do have a question for our panel, those of you on Zoom can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send questions directly to us. Please note, however, we do have a lot of you on the call today, so we may not have time to get to all of the questions. I'll now hand over to our chair for today's panel event, Baroness Deborah Bull.
Thanks, Marika, and can I also extend a really warm welcome to so many of you. It's fantastic to have so many people come together from across the very broad King's cultural community. For those of you who don't know me, as Marika said, I'm Deborah. I am now Vice Principal for London, but I joined King's in 2012, and since then I've been leading a team which aims to work across the arts and cultural sector in London and beyond to provide really unique learning and research opportunities for our staff and students, while at the same time trying to meet the needs and support the ambitions of the broader cultural sector. So I'm really pleased today that we are joined by such a broad panel. We have a King's academic and an artist, Kate Macmillan. We have a King's alumna, Natalia, and we have a cultural fellow in Gus. So I'm really sorry we don't have a King's student on the panel this time to complete the pack, but we do, of course, have a former student. And I think we have some students joining us today, and of course, many, many former students from our alumni community. Whoever you are all very, very welcome. So when we imagined this event just a few weeks ago, in what seems like another world now, we thought it would be interesting to focus on the cultural sector, not only on the challenges, but also on the creative responses to COVID and to the changes that we may see taking place. We know that the sector is undoubtedly amongst the hardest hit by the pandemic. Much of its workforce fall between the various income support schemes because the workforce is very heavily reliant on freelance talent. We know that revenue streams have dried up while no tickets are being sold, and we know that arts, culture and entertainment businesses are going to be amongst the last to open up because you cannot fully operate while social distancing rules are in place. But at the same time, we have seen some extraordinary creative responses. We've seen organizations reimagining themselves in order to better serve society's needs. We've seen others who kept us entertained with really rich online content. And we've seen other organizations who have pivoted in order to help homeschool this COVID generation whose learning is so challenged at the moment. So many of the conversations that I've been in across the cultural sector have focused on how the crisis might in fact drive some of the changes that we have wanted to see. So a focus on how, whatever the new normal is, it might be one in which there is greater equality, in which there is greater diversity, in which there is better integration across arts, education, social care, health, and the broader cultural and creative ecology. So there's some of the conversations that inspired the themes of the debate today. But of course, since that point, the world has witnessed a second seismic event with the terrible death of George Floyd 10 days ago, and the shockwaves that have followed, the passionate responses from communities around the world, including cultural communities, the direct action that it has inspired. These all suggest that perhaps at last a change is taking place. Perhaps this is a tipping point in social history. And it seems to me that we cannot gather today to talk about a sector whose fundamental role is to reflect and voice who we are and what we value, without at least acknowledging this broader reality, and without perhaps articulating some kind of hope that this tragic event, that it's this tragic event and not COVID that in the longer term defines and marks 2020 as a moment of change, positive change for future generations. So with all of that in mind, we've got three incredible experts who I know will bring us really thoughtful perspectives on those subjects and indeed on more. We've got an hour together. And I've challenged each of our panelists to speak for just 5 minutes at the outset, but then I hope we'll have a rich conversation amongst them, and of course a chance for you to put your questions. So do put your questions throughout. I think Marika is standing by ready to field and curate them and pass them on. So with that in mind, I'm not going to waste any more time on introductions, because Marika did a fine job of, and you have had the biographies of our very impressive panelists. So I'm first going to ask Natalia Petrova, who is a King's alumna, to speak for the first 5 minutes. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on this great panel today. I have, for the past 15 or so years, been working in various roles in the cultural sector here in UK and in other parts of the world. I am now a consultant with AEA Consulting, where we have the privilege of working exclusively with the cultural and creative sector organizations and their funders in an effort to respond and as much as we can anticipate the needs of the cultural sector. We are now looking into the implications of this pandemic on how cultural organizations operate and what strategies and mechanisms they need to adopt to pivot to a new and very uncertain reality. And that, of course, is exacerbated by other social, and economic events that we're experiencing now. The universal challenge is probably the uncertainty we're all facing and learning to plan for that. Before the pandemic, the creative industries and what we understand as a cultural sector were responsible for over 3 million of people being employed in the sector, and were one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy in the UK. And not just in the UK, but in many other countries around the world. At the core of the cultural sector, as Deborah mentioned, are the artists and creative professionals who often operate as freelancers and micro businesses, and the current lockdown and physical distancing measures present a great challenge to their livelihoods. For cultural organizations reliant on visitors and in-person participation, the task of balancing their books now and in the coming months is not an easy one as well. The pre-existing long-time barriers and challenges in the cultural sector have also been amplified by this pandemic. We can all, I think, talk to the lack of diversity, transparency, and access to entering the sector workforce, and particularly the leadership and board roles, the fragility of the operating models of arts nonprofits, and the disparity in access to the arts by various socioeconomic groups, which is likely to intensify in the coming months and years. These are some fundamental challenges and roadblocks the sector needs to address. Apart from the radical changes in the ways we all are able to consume culture and produce culture, we're seeing change in the way people and organizations in the sector collaborate. You know, the power of the network demonstrates itself in the way people are working and collaborating now, even when they're so far removed from each other physically. Some arts organizations are stepping up to embrace their civic and social role, and they are looking for ways to support the well-being of their communities and to support artists and creators. We are, of course, all witnessing a proliferation of digital content, from dance and crafts classes to live streams to robot tours of museum exhibitions and new virtual productions. And I'm sure that trend is kind of here to stay. The current shift in mobility is probably going to be a long-term one, meaning arts organizations and venues will be working with local artists increasingly and presenting to predominantly local audiences for some time. There is probably no handbook on how to navigate the current situation and no real direct precedent in history. So any solution, any new approach requires some degree of creativity. I think there is a Chinese saying that's been quoted a lot lately. When the wind blows, some build walls, others build windmills. And many of those who choose an artistic path in life are in constant process of building such windmills with you know, great degree of imagination and innovation. So if we're talking about creative response, I find that artists help us make sense of the current state we're in, offering coping strategies and imagining a way forward.
Thank you, Natalia. There's lots to pick up on there, and we'll come back to it. I'm going to ask Kate to come in next, Dr. Kate Macmillan.
Hi, and I hope that we've got all of my past and present students in the audience. It's lovely to, you know, I'm sort of missing that human contact and missing that contact with my students. And for those of you who have been students on some of the courses that I've taught, you'll know that I guess, you know, my lifelong kind of rant is about, you know, really looking at the inequalities in the cultural sector. You know, as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in Australia on stolen land. And so that sense of injustice has inflected all of my research and all of my teaching. And during this sort of crisis, I guess one of the things that I've been researching is looking at the way that the crisis is affecting women in particular. And I think what we're seeing, not just in terms of gender, but in terms of inequalities across the sector, is that the crisis is making things really visible. Now, of course, people that have been on the receiving end of those inequalities, you know, this is not new information, but perhaps for the broader community, you know, whether it's the fact that the report that was released yesterday by the government showing that Black British men were 4 times more likely to die from COVID than white men. You know, these are not a surprise if you're involved with these communities, but I think COVID is making all these things really clear to us. And I think one of the things, you know, for women in particular, the issue of childcare and so on, and also for artists, because a lot of them are falling through the gaps of the government support. They're largely freelancers. But as Natalia and Deborah have said, you know, we're also, you know, we're kind of used to, you know, facing adversity. That's what artists do. They're used to having to adapt to change and to sort of think on their feet. So in many ways, the creative sector is sort of perhaps better equipped than anyone to deal with this. And I'm just really hoping that it's a watershed moment to kind of, you know, really address what's happening in terms of inequalities in our sector, and not just the kind of the decoration that we're very fond of doing in the cultural sector, where we put on a you know, a Black Lives Matter exhibition or something, but we don't actually address the systemic racial inequalities within the people that are employed in our museums and our cultural sector. So yeah, I think it's really a time to look in the mirror. We've got a bit of extra time on our hands, perhaps, and I think it's the moment to use this time really effectively.
Thank you, Kate. Gus, over to you, Dr. Gus Casely-Hayford.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I adored what Natalia and Kate have said, that they've thrown down a gauntlet to us. I mean, this is a period unlike any that I've lived through, of immense challenge, and we have to find ways of rising to it. I mean, 2 months ago, I was in the very end of a role at the Smithsonian as the Director of National Museum of African Art, and I managed to get out on the very last plane from DC and arrived in London to a new role, but also to a London which was completely changed from the London I remembered by lockdown. And so it's been a fascinating first couple of months in this new role of trying to build the momentum around a new museum of the V&A East, which is a museum which is going to be different from the V&A as you might know it. That this is a museum in East London, 4 floors, completely new, but also alongside it, a collection centre which will house 250,000 objects in an open store so that it's accessible, 900 archives. And this is an audience which the people who live around this area are, it's one of the most challenged economically in Europe, but simultaneously it's one of the most creative. That it's an area up until about 10 years ago had the very highest proportion of visual artists of anywhere in Europe, and also one of the most culturally diverse. But many of these people aren't the people that traditionally have gone to the V&A. And so over the course of the next 3, possibly 4 now with the COVID related delays on the build, that we have to build relationships with those audiences and make them feel like V&A East is their own, and that it's a space in which they can feel comfortable and feel that they are reflected. And it's a thrilling project, the most exciting of my professional career, but there are huge challenges that, you know, the challenges now as schedules have been completely kind of thrown in the air. Our budgets, you know, that they are deeply challenged by the changes in schedule. We're looking at a building program which is a minimum of a year longer than we originally envisaged. And it's on a campus with UCL, with a new UCL building, a new BBC building, new Sadler's Wells, new London College of Fashion building. So it's a new cultural campus. And so we all have to together find a way of using this period in which we thought this would be a real opportunity for us to build these buildings and build a new community of interest. But the challenge of COVID, in which we can't gather, in which we can't, it's going to be difficult for us to generate the level of attention that we had hoped. The budgetary shortfalls are creating challenges across every area of delivery. But we are lucky, we have the Foundation for Future London and City Hall supporting the project. So I feel confident it's going to be okay, but these challenges have rocked us. And then alongside all of that, all of the logistical challenges with the build, as you can imagine, that once the builders get back on site after lockdown, there are problems with how do you actually socially distance and build a building? You know, all of these sorts of things that we are having to deal with, new ways of actually thinking about building a building and doing it under time pressure. We are having to move 250,000 objects from West London to East London, but also doing it with budgetary constraints, but also with thinking about how we deal with social distancing issues. And then we're also trying to think about how do we now, as a museum, respond to the changed world around us. People aren't going to want to travel as much. The sorts of partners we are working with, you know, how are they responding to COVID? That we want to be responsible and make sure that our program reflects the cultural complexity of the world, which was our original hope and remit. But how do we do that responsibly, thinking that we want to have a sustainable offer, thinking that that people aren't probably going to want to travel because of issues around COVID as much? How do we do all of that stuff and at the same time create a museum that we can feel fits with the needs of our local and national population? These are big challenges. But we feel in meeting them, we're going to create a 21st century institution, a new kind of institution that is engaged, that is equitable, that is sustainable, and that feels relevant to the communities that it serves.
That's great. Thank you, Gus. So much to pick into there. I mean, all of you spoken in different ways about inequality. And the need for systemic interventions. Natalia, you talked about workforce diversity, which I take to be an expression of inequality. So and Gus, you know, it's so interesting what you say, because the conventional worry about somewhere like the area you're in is that, you know, it starts out, the artists make it trendy, the developers move in, the artists are pushed out. Now, what's happened here is that the art has moved in, but it is big organizations, the BBC, Sadler's Wells, UCL, V&A. So there is a question, and it is really challenged now when we are locked down or less locked down, of how to be inclusive to communities. So I wonder whether I can speak to each of you could say something about inclusion and what that means for arts organizations going forward. You know, conventionally or traditionally, it's meant our doors are open, please come on in. And that's one form of inclusion, but it doesn't feel like a very forward-facing type of inclusion. So let Gus take a breath. Maybe Kate, can I come to you on that? Well, and then I'll come back to you, Gus.
Absolutely, Deborah. I think these are really important questions. And I think, you know, particularly if you look at the way that funding has been structured over the last decade or two, it's been really focused on audiences, of getting diverse audiences in. And that clearly hasn't worked. We know that, yes, more people are coming, but it's the same people coming more often. So, you know, free access, all of those things, it just really hasn't worked in the way that it was perceived that it might. And I think one of the reasons for that is because, you know, in that kind of attempt to get audiences engaging in different ways and different sorts of audiences, we've forgotten to think about who's staffing our organisations, who's structuring it, who's making decisions about what we see on the wall. And so audiences don't see themselves when they walk into a museum. And, you know, Gus was just talking about his sort of imaginings of how that might be different, which is extraordinary, but we really need to be seeing that across the board. And I think there's so much kind of tokenistic speak towards these sorts of things, and everyone kind of knows how to say the right things, but actually there's not the systemic change that we really need to see. And it's interesting you're talking about East London, because I live in Lewisham, in the borough of Lewisham, and you know, this is where all the Hackney rejects live now, because artists can't afford to live in East London anymore. So we've all sort of moved down to South East London where we can afford the rent. But you know, 1 in 100 people in Lewisham are homeless. You know, and so, you know, these are really big issues that we're grappling with. And I think the COVID crisis hasn't changed anything in as much as it's just made all of these things more visible. Like, we know that 40% of people living in poverty are Black British, even though they only make up 4% of the British population. I mean, these are really important things that we need to be talking about. And of course, COVID, all of those things are you know, highlighting this issue. And I think, you know, when I look at my teenage children and I look, they're studying history at secondary school, you know, they don't even study empire. You know, they skip from the Tudors to Queen Victoria, and they sort of miss out on understanding our historical relationship to the residue of colonialism that we find ourselves in. And I think until we address those, not just in our cultural sector, but in what we're teaching people, in what we're talking about, and what we're owning as a culture, that these things are just going to perpetuate. So I sort of feel really strongly that it's a time to really look honestly in the mirror about what our history is and what our privilege is. You know, I'm a white woman, you know, that comes with a huge amount of power. What am I doing with that power? These are these questions that I think we all have to ask ourselves.
Yeah. Gus, why don't you come in?
I mean, that's powerful stuff, and I utterly agree with everything that Kate says. And one of the things that has impacted me, I mean, it has been a period in which it's been difficult not to feel emotional and almost on a daily basis, as we've lost kind of friends and relatives over this period. But then also just that terrible incident of George Floyd, and the way in which it's brought to the surface so many things that have been suppressed, and just that last kind of half a dozen minutes of his life, which was filmed, and him, you know, calling out to stand up, calling out for a breath, and then calling out for his mother, and then silence. And, you know, that it was the silence. I mean, each one of those things impacted and affected me deeply, but that silence of so many people of color who have felt that the cultural sector has denied them a voice, that silence that, you know, you don't need to have a boot to the back of your neck, but that imposed silence. And we need, as a sector, to be the space in which people feel that they can find a place of refuge, a safe place which is safe enough to express themselves, to see themselves reflected, their histories, to deal with some of the contested issues that we're all living through, but also to project forward and to dream, to actually have spaces in which we can dream and think about the future together. And for many young people, that this has been a period in which there's been nothing but division in terms of politics. Politics isn't a space in which you dream and which you can create hope. We need, as a cultural sector, to create an alternative space in which people can come together, feel safe, and feel that they can dream. And, you know, for me, that void, that silence that was left in the last few seconds of that man's life, I think that I'm going to take those with me, and I'm going to make sure that we fill that void. We fill that void with voices of people who would otherwise be cast to the periphery of the cultural sector, and actually make sure that they are absolutely at the epicenter of everything that we do at V&A East. That will be my driver. That will be my main key objective. And I hope that cultural institutions, particularly those funded by public money, that they see this as an opportunity for us to change. This isn't just about COVID and how it's made us all feel humbled by a virus. It's also about wider, longer term injustices and how the culture sector has stood to one side and let these things perpetuate. It's time to change. It's not about building new buildings, bricks and mortar. It's about building hope and building new institutions by building new narrative and new opportunity.
Thank you, Gus. That's really powerful stuff too, without doubt. We've been talking about the need for systemic change, cultural change, systemic change. And I'm thinking about Dave O'Brien's book, which is coming out, Culture is Bad for You, which is a very provocative title if ever there was one. But what he's saying is that culture is bad for you if it perpetuates and perpetrates inequalities. There's some very powerful things in there about how we put so much on the shoulders of individuals to be the totem for their class, for their gender, for their sexuality, for their ethnicity, their race, rather than looking at the structures which are holding people outside. And I don't know who it's fair to come to next with this, but Natalia, we've not heard from you for a while, and I wonder, when you work with organizations, do you see good examples of how people are trying to change the culture and the systems in order to drive this change?
Yes, we do see some good examples, although I think the majority of arts leaders and organizations are struggling with that still. But a lot of them, I think, increasingly now, just in the past few weeks, recognize that the way their organizations work needs to change. And that goes for the structures of these organizations, but also for the overall system of how the sector operates and who we see at the table as decision makers. Some, but very few arts organizations have youth boards, for instance, who they go to for advice on programming. Because if you are creating a program for a specific community, why not create it with that community in collaboration? So we're seeing some good examples of that. And I think we are seeing some thinking, maybe not so much action just yet, around how recruitment and accountability of boards and leadership has to change as well.
So it needs to be throughout the organization, as you say it. It's the boards through to it's the decision makers as well, because they decide what gets put on the stage, who gets reflected, whose voices get heard. We've got some questions coming in, so I'm going to move to those now. But I'm going to come back to each of the panelists later for some further thoughts. So hold those in mind. We have a question here about collaboration, really. So how important is it going to be for the sector to work together, for organizations to work together? Is it, in the words of the question, united we stand, divided we fall, or is it every man for himself at the moment? I suspect I know what you're going to say about that, but perhaps Gus, as somebody who is leading a part of a big institution, do you want to say something on that?
We have to find ways of collaborating, and that isn't just about us doing that for programmatic benefit, but it's also in helping us to understand our audiences and to get a wider kind of moral perspective. That one of the things that I'm really keen with our new museum, that it's underpinned by a kind of moral integrity, which I think for many museums is something which you can get decoupled from over hundreds of years, because you are doing things which are expedient. We have the opportunity to start again and to begin to build an institution from the ground up. And a key part of that must be in us thinking about how we collaborate, but do it in ways which are equitable. So many museums that they collaborate in asymmetric partnerships that work to the benefit of the larger partner. And we need to find ways of working in a really sensitive way that means that partners, and it's not just going to be within Britain, it's certainly not going to be just in East London, but we are looking to global partners that can help to transform the lives, not just of our local populations, but of artists, in helping us. Because I think part of this must be in us, particularly in this period in which travel is going to be more difficult, but also as we think environmentally, is that the right way for us to kind of think about the future of our programming, it has to be that we are collaborating with institutions around the world that can help, either through digital or through other means, to bring voices into East London that reflect the dynamic demographic complexity of the local population. So for me, absolutely partnerships through and through almost everything that we do. I want to see us being open and sensitive to collaboration.
Kate, I'm going to pick up on a slightly related question, but this is, I guess, about internal partnerships or partnerships across genres and ideas. The question is, how important do you think interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary approaches are going to be in addressing the new challenges?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, most people that enjoy life and, you know, see opportunity understand that most of the time there's a whole bunch of people in the room with them that know things that they don't. And I think, you know, whether you're talking about equality or you're talking about collaboration, like coming to a new idea with the notion that there's lots of things that you don't know is sort of exciting. And I think artists do that a lot. I mean, we're collaborators, that's what we do. By nature, you know, we're thinking about, you know, what's science telling us, you know, what's this new technology that's available, what's this information, what's this research that's going on. We're kind of like blackbirds in a way. We sort of, you know, we're gathering everything around us, and in the same way, I think we're taking that approach to thinking about things like collaboration and how we respond to COVID. And I think Gus made a really important point, is that one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how rapid we have been able to change in relation to what COVID has presented us with. And yet for many of us, we've spent decades advocating for climate justice, and change has been so slow. Similarly with gender equality, change has been so slow. And what COVID has shown us is that we can actually change incredibly fast if we want to. So I think it's really thinking about how we can use this idea of our newly found potential for change and responsiveness, and actually apply it to lots of things. So just picking up on something that you mentioned before, I think one of our attendees mentioned about, you know, what are some of the examples of those things? What can we do? And certainly in Australia, when I was growing up and, you know, and I was starting out doing internships and different things, you know, there was really very, very clear and identifiable pathways to meet these issues of inequality. So there were things like internships for First Nation artists and First Nation curators. And there were mentor schemes to ensure that they didn't just stay at the bottom rung, that they were assisted up through organizations into positions of power and influence, that there was a requirement for representation on boards of directors. I mean, I think one of the things that we don't do so well in Britain is we're not very good at making rules. You know, for example, Boris Johnson could have said everyone that goes on the tube has to wear a mask, but we don't like to do that. We like to leave things up to people's individual common sense. This is a particularly strange British phenomenon, which I'm discovering. When clearly sometimes we actually just need to say, look, this is best practice, this is the way it should be, and this is what we need to do. And whether that's racial inequality, climate justice, you know, thinking through the potential for collaboration in resolving some of these things, I think we sort of just, you know, we need to be more definitive about what our responses are and stop being kind of wishy-washy.
That's quite an interesting top-down approach, Kate. You'll be glad to know the breaking news is apparently from June the 15th. We will all be required to wear face coverings on public transport. At least that's just popped into my breaking news box. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. I am very interested in Kate's top-down approach. Perhaps other people will come in. I wondered, we're being asked for some practical examples of ways in which arts organizations can reach out to create new connections with communities even now. And perhaps we can all pick a favorite. I'm going to start, chair's privilege, and I'm going to mention Slung Low in Holbeck in Leeds, who are a community a theatre company based in a community, who really decided on day one what they do is storytelling. They create narratives and they connect with people, and actually people's narratives right now are their narratives of need, and the needs are very clear. So they pivoted entirely to become the first responder for Leeds Council for that area. So when somebody needs dog food or taking to a doctor, Slung Low step up and they do it. And at the same time, they've created an art gallery on lampposts. So they're collecting the art people are creating, they're printing it up, and they're putting it on lampposts. They do a show once a week too. So I found this really inspiring because it is, you know, totally innovative and different, but it is absolutely focused on what the community needs. And one can't help thinking that the depth of that relationship will be enhanced by this partnership through this experience. So that's kind of my example, top of head. Natalia, why don't you tell us something that's inspired you?
Sure. I think what I'm finding is that the organizations that have previously had strong links with their communities are sort of navigating this better, and it maybe comes easier to them in a more organic way. One example that comes to mind is an organization called Alight in Gloucester, who has been working a lot with their local artists and younger artists in commissioning new work, basically. And they did so during the lockdown as well. I think they commissioned 6 young local artists to produce artworks in all different genres and formats. And it's been really great to see how engaged you know, both local audiences and artists were in that.
Thank you. Kate?
So there's so many great things going on. I mean, one of the things obviously everyone will know is that, you know, something that I guess I'm particularly interested in looking at is the role of the art market in the visual arts sector. And of course, that sort of immediately died when COVID happened. And, you know, some of you may know that 60% of gallery sales happen at global art fairs. So all of a sudden galleries were, you know, without an income, which was obviously affecting the incomes of artists. So there was this fantastic hashtag called the Artist Support Pledge that was instigated by a London artist called Matthew Burrows. You can find him on Instagram. And the idea was that artists put images of their work up to £200 on Instagram. And once they'd sold 5, they made a pledge to buy another artist's work. And now I think this has generated something like £30 million in income directly to artists. So it's quite interesting because on one level because, you know, a lot of artists, I guess, have had lots of freelance work cancelled, whether it's running workshops or art groups or freelance teaching or being technicians in galleries. All of that immediately went. So this has given artists income, some of them for the first time, in a way that didn't seem feasible before. And I think it's also taken a little bit of power away from the galleries, which is interesting because I think what we'll see now is a little bit of the power dynamic will be addressed in different ways, and perhaps artists will feel like they're more able to self-determine in a way that they weren't able to before. So that's my favourite thing in the visual arts sector.
And Gus, one from you.
As a historian, I hope you don't mind if I go look backwards for my example. And mine is during the Second World War. I mean, even where I'm living here in Hampstead, took a huge number of hits from the Luftwaffe. I think something like 30,000 bombs fell on London, killing more than 40,000 people. And culture pretty much came to a stop. And so all of the national museums closed and everything. They took the collection from the National Gallery to some mines in Wales. And then there was a kind of a moment of recognition that we need culture, you know, that we're risking our lives on a daily basis. And that if there is anything that we need at this time, it is to be uplifted. It was then that the sense of the importance of culture really began to be discussed and expressed really in very articulate ways. And Kenneth Clark, who was the director of the National Gallery, he decides that, no, at risk to human life, at risk to those national collections, will bring back some of those works. And they bring back a handful of works, and people queue across Trafalgar Square. And alongside that, Myra Hess, who's one of the great pianists of the time, that she plays concerts. And by the end of the war, more than 1 million people had queued for a handful of works and to hear that music. I mean, in terms of a statement about the value of culture, that people were prepared, when it came to it, to risk their lives, because at the end of the day, we were fighting for freedom, and what greater expression of that than culture? And I think at this time in which COVID is reconfiguring the way in which we think and feel about the world around us, the arts are the space in which we need to be navigating some of that. And I think I'm hopeful that government will realize the value of it, and that they will turn to the arts, invest in it, because I know so many cultural institutions have found this period to be almost existentially threatening. It's now that the government needs to reinvest in culture, its value to unite populations, its value to raise hearts and minds. This is the time to invest in culture, invest in people.
Thank you, Gus. I'm sorry. There's a lot of questions coming in now, and there's going to be too many for us to answer. So we need to work out afterwards whether Marika can take them and we can perhaps field them out amongst the panelists and answer them by email or some way later. There's a few questions coming in about pathways into the sector, and some of them focus on the precariousness and the difficulties, and this question of how do we create greater access, of more equal access to the sector, and others simply ask about what advice would you have for recent graduates who are wanting to commence a career in the notoriously difficult gallery and museum sector. So, I mean, we could go to perhaps Kate. Maybe we could go to you on how do you start a career in galleries, and then perhaps I might come to Natalia with a question about how we increase equality of access into the sector. What can organizations do? Not what can governments do, perhaps what could organizations do? So Kate.
Well, it's a really tricky question, and if any of my ex-students are in the room, you'll know that, that for many years I was the careers lead in CMCI. So this is a question that I had a lot. And I think this is in many ways where the inequality starts, because most of you will know that you have to spend a year or two doing stuff for nothing, and you have to be in a position where you can give your labor for free often. And I think that it's even, you know, those, as we've been saying the whole time, COVID is going to make those inequalities even more stark, I think. So I think it's a combination of, you know, doing what you can to pay your bills, but keeping very focused on what your goal is, where you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, and what can you do in this context while you're doing that other job to pay your bills, or whatever it is that you're having to do right now, to keep that focus in the front of your mind. I mean, when I finished art school, I went and ran a community centre for free for a year, you know, like for no money. And I worked, you know, doing all these other rubbish jobs at the side to pay my rent. And I think it's just, you know, and I'm sure nothing has really changed in that respect. But I think I've got a number of students at the moment doing their MA dissertations, and I've been working with them to think, right, how can you make your dissertation strategic and make you employable? So a lot of them have been changing their research to think about the way organizations, and looking at case studies of organizations and what they've done to make you know, to be responsive to COVID and so on, so that they can go out into the sector and they can say, look, I know about system change. I know about digital content. I know about how we engage audiences in online capacities. These are skills that I've got. And I've been working on this research, on this case study, and there are things that I can bring to your organisation. And I think what we're going to see, particularly in the next 12 months, is we're going to see people in, departments in museums that are going to dry up, and other departments are going to become very large. So I think it's just about thinking, what are the skills organisations what skills are they going to need to kind of to boot up again, and to use this time to do all of that professional development to make those skills really to develop them further, I guess.
Thank you, Kate. Natalia, inclusivity within the recruitment process.
So I think when an organization is looking at its recruitment practices, there are ways for them to, think how to make it more inclusive. Think about, the language they use in recruitment ads, from simple things like that to how and where they recruit. There is an organization, a support organization in UK called Creative Access that works a lot with, more offering opportunities to diverse groups, and there are other initiatives like that. I think it's also about the requirements they have in place for even more junior entry-level positions. So kind of looking at those and looking what's sounding realistic at this moment. And as Kate said, I think the current pandemic is actually going to shift a lot of functions within organizations. So if I were looking for a job right now, I would look at what skills would be required and what's going to really make those organizations sustainable in the long term. And a lot of that does require having diverse workforce, because this is where good ideas come from, and this is where change comes from. So I think this is not probably a straightforward answer to your question, but it's probably a complex of measures that just needs to be addressed in recruitment practices.
And do you have a sense of, it's very good advice, think about what organizations are going to need. In your role, do you have a crystal ball? Can you see what kind of skills and roles they're going to need in order to recover?
I don't necessarily have a crystal ball, but I think we all are seeing, this proliferation of digital production and distribution. So it's certainly skills related to the production side of that, but also distribution and working with data seems increasingly important. I've heard a lot from organizations how they're looking to recruit data analysts to understand their audiences better across these digital channels and match that with what they know about their sort of physical audiences. Some other probably very important roles are going to be around engagement and working with communities and partnerships with other sectors, for sure.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to close by asking, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to try and be cheeky, but my last question to you all, which I'm going to give you a moment to think about, is what changes what has changed that you would like us to retain? Where would you not like us to go back? And what's the good that's going to come out of this? So that's going to be my last question. But just before that, there's a very interesting question here about the cultural sector as part of a wider social ecology, including education, employment law, taxation, transport, etc. So which bits do you think we need to focus on in order to make the cultural sector more inclusive? I mean, is it the cost of housing in London, for instance? Is it the education system? Have I just given all the answers? I don't know. Kate, you're smiling. Why don't you?
Oh, I have so many ideas. I always think about the New Deal and the Green New Deal that's come out as in a sort of like an updated version of the New Deal, which basically saw America being dragged out of the Great Depression through massive investment in infrastructure and also the arts. Thousands of artists were employed to construct sculptures and national monuments, and it was incredible. It was sort of, you know, system changing, culture changing. And I really feel that we have to marry the sort of economic recovery with a green recovery. So I don't want to go back to flying somewhere every 2 weeks. I don't want to go back to, you know, racing around like a headless chook all day, you know, getting from one place to the next. You know, I'm actually saving money because I'm not going out and doing things. I'm spending more time in my studio practicing my work. I'm spending more time with my children. You know, I'm spending more time talking to my friends that I was too busy to talk to before. So I feel like there's a rebalancing and a revaluing of things that can go on. And I think it absolutely has to be kind of, from a government perspective, it has to be situated within this sort of green economic recovery. And I know the government has been talking about these things, but I really hope they mean it, because I think that's the only thing that's going to save us right now, to be honest.
But I also think that post Brexit as well, that we need to be thinking doubly about how we reconfigure as a nation our relationships with the world. And culture needs to be front and center for government in thinking. I mean, the creative industries are such a major driver of this country, and we have not had the investment in the past, the acknowledgement, the support. And this is the time in which government could think about how it allocates to culture, and how, if it was to reconfigure that kind of relationship, the sort of benefit, not just in terms of educating a new generation, but I'm talking about in terms of, you know, economic benefit to this country. And I would love to see that, you know, that the government begins to acknowledge that the culture sector, just because we're nice people, it doesn't mean that you can take advantage of us and push us around and forget us when it's convenient.
And in terms of what you would like to retain from this period, Kate's talked about perhaps going a little slower, taking time, not rushing around. I'm with her on that. What about you, Gus?
I felt people, I mean, I've had, you know, a lot of people have talked about having COVID dreams, you know, kind of these odd dreams in which, you know, for me, it's been kind of drawing moments from across my career, and it's allowed me to be a little bit more reflective. And I think that as a period, that has made people, I think, a little bit nicer. One walks down the street and strangers are smiling at one, and you feel a sense of community flexing and building a kind of an embrace around one. And I think I would love it if we held on to some of that. You know, in a city like London, you can feel very lost and anonymous at times. And the idea of, from this, a sense of community, particularly cultural community, if that was something which would sustain, that would really make me feel so happy that something good came out of something quite so awful.
And Natalia, right up against the clock, but what about you?
I think it's kind of this new sense, a new intensified level of cooperation and collaboration that I would like to take into the future, you know, because this is such a universal thing we're all experiencing. And I've seen people collaborating, you know, from New Zealand to Australia to Brazil to London. So I'd love to keep that going.
Well, you have been a most collaborative and fantastic panel. I've been a terrible chair because there are so many questions we haven't been able to get to. That's partly because your questions have been fantastically complex and deserve much more time than we're able to give. I'm going to talk to Marika, see if we can find a way to field some of them out to our panelists and get some answers back to you, either by email or on social media. Please do keep in touch, either through the alumni team, or you can follow the cultural community on @CulturalKings on Instagram or Twitter. Mainly thank you to you all for finding the time to join us today. I hope you found it as fascinating as I found it. I look forward to further opportunities when perhaps we will gather in the flesh, but we will certainly gather in the spirit as we have today. So till then, stay safe. Many thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.